cold inland waters across the northern United States have long served as major corridors for shipping and travel, where vessels move through conditions shaped by sudden weather shifts and seasonal transitions that can change with little warning once they begin to form. Across decades of maritime and aviation history, these lakes have produced records preserved in logs, partial reports, and incomplete transmissions, where many events were later reconstructed rather than fully witnessed. As these cases are studied together, you are drawn into accounts of disappearances, sudden storms, and unresolved final communications that span different locations but begin to feel connected through repeating circumstances. Each lake holds its own incidents, yet the evidence often arrives in fragments that leave gaps between what was recorded and what was never fully explained, where certainty fades at the exact moment conditions became most severe. The lake that swallows ships, Lake Superior's reputation of death. Beyond the northern edge of the American Midwest, where forests thin into dark stone shorelines and cold winds travel uninterrupted across an inland horizon that resembles an ocean more than a lake, there exists a body of water so vast that distance becomes difficult to judge, and weather seems to arrive without warning. Lake Superior stretches across more than 31,000 square miles, touching Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario, its immense surface often appearing calm from shore even as conditions change far beyond sight. To early voyageurs, fishermen, and sailors, it was a route of commerce and survival, but also something harder to explain. A place where silence could settle too suddenly, and storms seemed to rise with startling force, leaving behind wreckage, unanswered absences, and stories repeated in lowered voices by those who spent enough time crossing its waters. The name itself carries traces of warning. French explorers in the 17th century referred to it as Le Lac Supérieur, meaning the upper lake, because it sat above the lower Great Lakes system, though indigenous communities had long known it by other names and meanings. Among the Anishinaabe, Lake Superior was often understood as Gichigami, or Great Sea, an unusually fitting description for a lake whose horizon disappears into distance like open ocean. Even experienced mariners struggle to understand its scale because Superior behaves unlike smaller inland waters. At its deepest point, the lake plunges to more than 1,300 feet, while the average depth and sheer volume of water give it an unsettling ability to shape its own weather, producing fog, towering waves, and violent temperature shifts that can emerge with little warning. On maps, the lake appears stable and contained, but sailors gradually learned that Superior rarely behaves like something enclosed. When crossing hundreds of uninterrupted miles can build waves exceeding 20 or even 30 feet during severe storms, and because the lake's surface temperature often remains painfully cold, especially below the surface, survival becomes a race measured in minutes rather than hours. Even during summer, much of the deeper water remains near freezing, frequently hovering around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature cold enough to trigger cold water shock almost immediately after immersion. Sailors who entered the water unexpectedly sometimes found breathing difficult before they even had time to think, their muscles weakening long before rescue could arrive. That cold has contributed to one of Superior's most unsettling reputations, because unlike warmer lakes or oceans, it often refuses to surrender what disappears beneath it. Bodies lost in deep water are less likely to decompose rapidly because of the low temperatures, and natural gases responsible for buoyancy do not form in the same way. Divers, historians, and rescue teams have long remarked upon the eerie preservation found below the surface, where wrecks can remain astonishingly intact for generations. Wooden hulls rest in darkness with masts still standing, cargo still stored, and cabins sometimes preserved so completely that time itself appears interrupted. Beneath the shifting grey surface lies what researchers have described as one of the largest collections of freshwater shipwrecks in the world. Commerce helped make the lake dangerous. During the 19th century and into the industrial era, Lake Superior became an essential corridor for timber, iron ore, coal, grain, and manufactured goods moving through the Great Lakes system. Freighters crossed immense distances despite unpredictable weather because economic necessity left little room for hesitation. Harbours such as Duluth, Thunder Bay, and Marquette became gateways of industry, while captains learned to read skies, pressure changes, and shoreline signals with near-obsessive caution. Yet caution did not always matter. Superior's storms developed reputations for speed and violence, sometimes transforming manageable conditions into deadly seas within hours. The most feared period arrived late in the shipping season, particularly during November, when warmer air masses collided with freezing northern systems and fierce winds swept across open water. Sailors gave these storms names heavy with superstition and memory, because experience taught them that ordinary language often failed to describe what unfolded there. Historical accounts speak of waves rising like moving walls, steel ships groaning under pressure, visibility collapsing beneath snow and freezing spray, and compasses rendered nearly useless during frantic attempts to stay on course. Men who spent decades on water sometimes admitted that Superior frightened them in ways oceans had not. Few disasters shaped the lake's reputation more than the catastrophic storm of November 1913, later remembered as the Great Lakes Storm or the White Hurricane. Lasting roughly 4 days, the storm combined hurricane-force winds, blinding snow, and immense waves across multiple lakes, though Superior endured some of the worst conditions. More than 250 people died, at least a dozen ships were lost, and many others were stranded or damaged. Communication systems of the period failed to provide consistent warnings, leaving captains forced into impossible decisions. Survivors later recalled violent darkness interrupted only by crashing water and the terrifying sound of ships breaking apart somewhere beyond visibility. What unsettled observers most was not merely the destruction, but the silence afterward. Some vessels vanished almost completely, their crews gone without witnesses or explanation, leaving families to wait through days and weeks for fragments of certainty that never arrived. Newspapers documented losses in stark detail, yet many questions remained unanswered because Superior rarely revealed enough evidence to reconstruct exactly what had happened. Even when wrecks were eventually found decades later, the moments leading to disaster often remained hidden beneath freezing water and fractured steel. By the 20th century, comparisons between Lake Superior and the Bermuda Triangle had quietly begun appearing in articles, documentaries, and historical discussions, though not always for the same reasons. The Bermuda Triangle became associated with dramatic claims of unexplained disappearances across the Atlantic, often amplified by speculation that stretched beyond documented evidence. Superior's reputation developed differently. Here, mystery emerged less from sensational storytelling and more from accumulation, from centuries of wrecks, vanished crews, strange coincidences, and a death toll grounded in recorded maritime history. Historians frequently note that the Great Lakes collectively have claimed thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives, with Superior often regarded as the harshest among them. Yet statistics alone fail to explain why sailors feared it. Fear came from repeated encounters with unpredictability, from stories exchanged between crews who watched calm mornings become disasters before sunset, from reports of sudden fog swallowing visibility so completely that shoreline lights vanished, and from the strange psychological isolation produced by an inland sea, whose scale erased familiar reference points. Sailors spoke of hearing winds change tone across the water, of sleeping lightly because storms could arrive without warning, and of nights when darkness felt impossibly large. Among mariners, an old saying endured with unsettling persistence: Lake Superior never gives up her dead. Though popularised widely after the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975, the sentiment reflected something older and deeply rooted in experience. Superior's cold, preserved wreckage concealed evidence and encouraged uncertainty, turning ordinary maritime tragedy into something heavier, stranger, and unfinished. For every ship whose story could be pieced together, another seemed to dissolve into incomplete reports, missing timelines, or unanswered assumptions. And somewhere beneath those dark waters, the lake still holds stories that ended without witnesses, the night the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished. Across the darkening waters of November, the massive silhouette of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald moved steadily through Lake Superior beneath weather that seemed to shift faster than expectation. The lake stretched outward in cold grey distances, its surface unsettled by winds that had already begun gathering force as daylight thinned across the horizon on November 10th, 1975. To sailors familiar with the Great Lakes, November carried a reputation difficult to ignore, because storms arriving late in the shipping season often transformed ordinary routes into dangerous calculations of timing, judgment, and endurance. Yet from a distance, there was little in the movement of the Edmund Fitzgerald to immediately suggest catastrophe. only a steel freighter continuing westward through a lake that had spent centuries reminding crews how quickly calm could disappear. Built to endure punishing freight routes across the Great Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald had earned a reputation for reliability that made later events feel difficult to reconcile. Launched in 1958 and measuring 729 feet in length, the ship ranked among the largest freighters on the lakes at the time and represented the scale of industrial shipping that moved iron ore, coal, grain and steel through inland waterways connecting much of North America. Nicknamed Big Fitz by some sailors, the vessel carried taconite iron ore pellets mined in Minnesota and transported material essential to steel production. Modern for its time, equipped with radar and built for heavy cargo, the Edmund Fitzgerald inspired confidence among crews who saw it as stable and dependable, a working giant shaped for rough water rather than defeated by it. Far from shore, changing forecasts and strengthening winds slowly altered the character of the lake, turning routine movement into careful calculation. Earlier that day, the Edmund Fitzgerald had departed from Superior, Wisconsin, carrying more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets toward a steel mill near Detroit. Another freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, travelled behind it along a similar route, separated by distance yet close enough that communication remained possible. Weather advisories had already warned of worsening conditions, and reports across Lake Superior described intensifying winds, falling temperatures, and seas growing increasingly difficult to navigate. Experienced captains understood that Superior's storms did not always arrive gradually. Conditions that seemed manageable in 1 hour could become dangerous by the next, particularly in November, when opposing weather systems collided over open water. Over the marine radio, nearby captains exchanged weather observations that hinted at conditions growing harsher than many had anticipated. Wind speeds strengthened as gale warnings escalated, and waves reportedly reached heights capable of striking vessels with punishing force. Snow and spray reduced visibility while freezing temperatures threatened to coat decks and equipment in ice, adding weight and danger to already unstable movement. Although Great Lakes freighters were engineered for difficult conditions, sailors knew there remained limits beyond which experience and machinery became increasingly uncertain. Communication between ships turned practical, focused less on routine conversation and more on survival, positioning, and weather. Even before direct damage reports began to surface, the broader storm system over Lake Superior was already evolving into a layered atmospheric structure where multiple pressure zones reinforced one another over open water. In environments without land interruption, wind fields can sustain energy for extended periods, allowing wave systems to build in both height and complexity as the storm matures. What initially resembled another difficult November crossing gradually became something more uncertain, as towering waves and worsening visibility pressed against the Edmund Fitzgerald's progress. At various points during the voyage, Captain Ernest M. McSorley of the Edmund Fitzgerald communicated concerns about the ship's condition, including damage believed to involve vents, railings, and deck structures. Reports later suggested that the vessel had taken on water and suffered from worsening strain, as Superior grew increasingly violent around it. The lake itself became difficult to read, obscured by darkness, snow, and immense water movement that erased familiar reference points. Sailors crossing Lake Superior sometimes described storms as disorienting not simply because of force, but because they altered perception, turning even known routes into spaces of uncertainty. Under these conditions, structural stress on large freighters becomes increasingly distributed across multiple hull sections, rather than isolated to a single impact point, meaning that fatigue can accumulate gradually, even when no single failure is immediately visible. At the same time, onboard radar systems of the era were vulnerable to signal distortion caused by heavy precipitation and surface interference, reducing the clarity of returns precisely when external visibility was at its lowest. Reports emerging from the vessel began to suggest complications aboard, including damage concerns that introduced new urgency into an already dangerous passage. During communication with the Arthur M. Anderson, McSorley reportedly stated that the Edmund Fitzgerald had sustained topside damage and was listing, while heavy seas continued striking the vessel. At one point, the ship's radar systems were reportedly compromised, limiting the crew's ability to navigate through worsening visibility and forcing greater dependence on nearby vessels for positional guidance. The Anderson, trailing behind, relayed information about navigational markers and weather conditions, functioning almost like a distant companion moving through the same darkness. Yet despite concern, communication remained measured rather than panicked, a detail that later unsettled investigators because no clear sign of immediate collapse appeared in surviving transmissions. From the deck of the Arthur M. Anderson, sailors continued tracking the Edmund Fitzgerald through darkness, weather, and intermittent communication as the distance between the ships narrowed and disappeared in uneven visibility. Waves reportedly climbed to immense heights, sometimes estimated at around 25 feet or more, while winds intensified across Lake Superior's open surface. Visibility shifted unpredictably as snow squalls crossed the water, obscuring shapes and light. At times, the Edmund Fitzgerald's presence ahead could be sensed only through radar returns or brief visual confirmation between bursts of weather. For crews aboard nearby vessels, the lake no longer resembled a route between destinations but an unstable environment, narrowing human control. As visibility continued to degrade, communication between vessels became increasingly dependent on brief, functional exchanges that prioritized positional awareness over descriptive reporting. In such conditions, nearby ships often function as reference points rather than support systems, creating a form of navigational dependency where each vessel confirms the existence of the others through intermittent contact rather than direct observation. By late evening, radio exchanges had become shorter, practical, and increasingly shaped by the growing force of Lake Superior itself. At approximately 7:10 p.m, Captain McSorley delivered what became the Edmund Fitzgerald's final known transmission to the Arthur M. Anderson. "We are holding our own." The words sounded calm and restrained and almost ordinary, considering the surrounding conditions. No distress signal followed. No emergency declaration interrupted the silence that came next. For investigators, sailors, and families, the absence of panic became one of the voyage's most unsettling details because catastrophe appeared to arrive without warning. After one final known transmission, certainty surrounding the Edmund Fitzgerald narrowed abruptly into unanswered minutes and empty water. Radar contact disappeared. Attempts to communicate brought no reply. The crew aboard the Arthur M. Anderson continued trying to establish contact, while the weather still battered the lake with fierce force, but nothing returned across the radio except silence. 29 men had been aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. None survived. Search operations began despite dangerous conditions, yet immediate evidence remained frustratingly limited. No survivors appeared. Few visible signs explained what had happened in those final moments on Lake Superior. Search crews arriving in the aftermath encountered a lake still unsettled, where debris remained scarce, and explanations proved frustratingly incomplete. Aircraft, Coast Guard personnel, and nearby ships searched through dangerous conditions, though hopes of rescue faded quickly in Superior's freezing temperatures. Later that month, sonar surveys identified the wreck resting deep beneath the lake, approximately 530 feet below the surface. Investigators discovered that the Edmund Fitzgerald had broken into two large sections separated across the lake bed, though exactly how and when structural failure occurred remained unclear. The cold water had preserved evidence in ways unusual elsewhere, but preservation did not equal clarity. Years of investigation produced competing theories about the Edmund Fitzgerald's final moments, yet none removed every uncertainty surrounding the ship's disappearance. One explanation suggested that massive waves overwhelmed the vessel, sometimes described through the possibility of rogue or closely timed wave impacts capable of placing immense pressure on the hull. Another theory argued that the ship may have grounded on a shoal earlier in the voyage, sustaining damage that later worsened beneath heavy seas. Others examined structural fatigue, hatch failures, flooding, or shifting cargo as contributing causes. Official investigations evolved, including reports from the National Transportation Safety Board and later maritime analyses, but complete agreement never emerged. The Edmund Fitzgerald remained studied precisely because no explanation resolved every contradiction or uncertainty left behind by Lake Superior. Long after the last transmission faded, Lake Superior kept whatever unfolded around the Edmund Fitzgerald beyond the reach of certainty. White Hurricane, when Lake Superior became a graveyard. Before daylight fully settled over Lake Superior, subtle shifts in wind and temperature had already begun unsettling crews who depended on familiar patterns to read the water. November had arrived with the cold certainty sailors expected, Yet something about the weather gathering across the Great Lakes in early November 1913 felt increasingly difficult to interpret, as if ordinary signals no longer aligned with experience. The lake stretched beneath low skies in restless grey motion, carrying freighters loaded with ore, coal and manufactured goods along shipping routes that connected distant ports despite the season's worsening conditions. To sailors crossing Lake Superior, storms were familiar companions, but familiarity often rested upon an uneasy understanding that the lake rarely behaved according to expectation for long. Low clouds gathered unevenly above the lake as November weather systems collided, creating conditions that few sailors yet understood would soon become historic. Meteorologists later determined that the catastrophe known as the White Hurricane emerged from the interaction of at least two major storm systems moving across the region, producing fierce winds, freezing temperatures, snow squalls, and extraordinary pressure differences over the Great Lakes. On November 7th, barometric readings had already begun falling, and weather forecasts issued gale warnings to vessels moving through the lakes, though early 20th century forecasting remained limited compared with modern systems. Crews relied on signal flags, wireless communication when available, local observations and experience shaped through years on water. But Lake Superior often transformed weather into something far more difficult to predict. Along separate stretches of Lake Superior, captains attempted to continue ordinary voyages, while gale warnings and falling barometric pressure hinted that the White Hurricane was strengthening. Shipping rarely stopped easily because cargo schedules, economic demands and the realities of distance left little room for hesitation, particularly in an era when maritime movement across the Great Lakes formed a critical artery of industry. Freighters pushed westward and eastward through worsening conditions, some carrying iron ore while others transported coal or grain, their steel hulls designed for endurance yet vulnerable to forces larger than calculation. Reports from harbours and ships suggested worsening winds, though few observers fully grasped that the storm gathering across Lake Superior and neighbouring waters would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in Great Lakes maritime history. Snow moved sideways across open water as visibility narrowed, and waves grew increasingly violent, leaving ships to navigate conditions that felt larger than prediction. Winds across portions of the lakes reportedly exceeded hurricane force, with estimates later reaching 70 miles per hour or more in some locations, while immense waves rose repeatedly against hulls already strained by freezing spray and violent movement. Darkness arrived early beneath thick cloud cover, turning distance into uncertainty and forcing sailors to interpret movement through incomplete visual fragments. Ice formed across decks and rigging, adding dangerous weight to ships already struggling against relentless seas. In places where Lake Superior widened toward open horizon, crews described conditions that resembled ocean storms rather than inland travel, a comparison repeated often by survivors who struggled afterward to explain what they had witnessed. Messages passing between vessels revealed growing uncertainty as crews struggled to judge distance, direction, and the changing temperament of the lake. Wireless communication in 1913 remained inconsistent and vulnerable to interruption, yet fragments of reports emerged describing worsening seas, damaged ships, and captains searching for shelter where little shelter existed. Navigation itself became uncertain because snow and darkness obscured shoreline landmarks, while violent water altered speed and control. What sailors believed manageable in daylight increasingly unravelled beneath storm conditions that seemed to intensify faster than expectation. The White Hurricane did not arrive as one dramatic moment, but through a steady collapse of confidence, each worsening hour reducing certainty about location, timing, and survival. Across multiple shipping routes, the White Hurricane began tearing apart assumptions of safety as freighters encountered towering seas, freezing spray, and worsening darkness. The storm ultimately devastated vessels across several Great Lakes, including Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. But Lake Superior earned particular fear because of its size, cold, and violent openness. Historical accounts record ships damaged, stranded, or destroyed as crews battled winds powerful enough to break lifeboats, flood decks, and cripple steering. Among the vessels lost during the wider catastrophe were freighters such as the Henry B. Smith, which vanished on Lake Superior after leaving harbour near Marquette, Michigan, leaving behind only scattered wreckage discovered years later. The disappearance unsettled observers precisely because certainty vanished alongside the ship, replacing explanation with fragments. Several vessels attempting to survive the storm vanished from certainty altogether, leaving behind fragmented reports, scattered wreckage, and unanswered absences that deepened the scale of disaster. Across the Great Lakes, at least a dozen major vessels were lost, and more than 30 seriously damaged during what historians later called the Great Lakes Storm of 1913, while estimates of the dead surpassed 250 people. Some ships disappeared without survivors capable of describing final moments, forcing investigators to reconstruct events through debris fields, damaged wrecks, or incomplete wireless messages interrupted by worsening weather. On Lake Superior, the White Hurricane reinforced fears sailors already carried, because the lake's vastness allowed destruction to unfold far from witnesses, leaving families and ports waiting for arrivals that never came. Survivors who later spoke about the White Hurricane often described confusion before fear, recalling moments when sound, movement, and visibility seemed to collapse into chaos. Sailors reported waves arriving from conflicting directions, violent impacts against steel hulls, freezing water sweeping across decks, and darkness so complete that distance became impossible to judge. Some accounts described hearing whistles from nearby vessels disappear suddenly into wind and snow, while others remembered the unsettling sensation of moving without clear orientation, unable to tell whether ships remained on course or drifted toward unseen danger. Fear emerged gradually because confusion came first. Conditions felt unreal enough that sailors struggled to understand the scale of danger until survival itself became uncertain. Days after the storm finally weakened, rescue efforts and shoreline discoveries revealed how completely Lake Superior and the surrounding Great Lakes had transformed into a graveyard. Wreckage washed ashore in scattered fragments, while damaged ships limped toward ports carrying exhausted crews and stories that often sounded impossible to those who had remained on land. Newspapers documented devastation with growing alarm as the scale of destruction became clearer. Destroyed freighters, drowned sailors, vanished crews, and coastlines littered with remnants of cargo and broken timber. Yet even then, explanation remained incomplete because many final moments unfolded unwitnessed beneath snow, darkness, and freezing water. Historical investigations into the White Hurricane uncovered destruction measured not only through wrecked ships and lost lives, but through moments no witness survived to describe. Meteorologists later reconstructed atmospheric conditions, maritime historians traced vessel routes, and underwater discoveries gradually revealed the resting places of some lost ships, yet gaps persisted in the historical record. Questions remained about precise timelines, mechanical failures, navigational decisions, and why some vessels survived conditions that destroyed others. Lake Superior complicated certainty because storms there often obscured evidence, and deep cold water preserved wreckage without necessarily preserving understanding. Even decades later, accounts of the White Hurricane continued unsettling historians and sailors because the scale of destruction often felt strangely difficult to comprehend on inland water. Comparisons to ocean disasters emerged not only because of the death toll, but because witnesses repeatedly described seas behaving beyond expectation, as though the boundaries between lake and ocean had briefly disappeared beneath storm conditions few crews believed possible. For sailors familiar with Lake Superior, the White Hurricane became more than historical memory. It became warning, proof that inland waters could unleash violence vast enough to erase ships, silence crews, and leave behind history stitched together only through fragments. What unfolded across Lake Superior during those frozen days left behind enough wreckage to measure disaster, yet too little certainty to explain everything the storm erased. Lake Superior's phantom seafloor, mapping gaps that never fully closed. Early hydrographic surveys of Lake Superior relied on sparse depth sampling methods that recorded underwater terrain through incremental manual measurements rather than continuous imaging systems. These early approaches depended heavily on line soundings and localized depth checks, producing fragmented representations of the lake bed that could only approximate its true complexity. At the time, the goal was not to produce a perfectly continuous model, but to establish navigational safety and general awareness of underwater hazards in one of the largest freshwater bodies in the world. As surveying technology expanded through later centuries, newly collected depth readings began to introduce refinements that did not always align perfectly with earlier recorded lakebed interpretations. When more systematic mapping techniques became available, particularly through sonar-based systems, they revealed that earlier assumptions about certain underwater slopes and basin transitions required adjustment. These corrections did not erase the original data, but instead recontextualized it, creating overlapping layers of interpretation that had to be reconciled rather than replaced. Deep basin regions of Lake Superior contained structural variations that challenged early attempts to construct a continuous and uniformly detailed underwater profile. The sheer scale of the lake, combined with abrupt depth transitions and complex underwater formations, meant that certain areas were initially undersampled or generalized in early mapping efforts. As a result, some portions of the lakebed existed in early records as broad estimations rather than precise contours, leaving room for later reinterpretation. Improvements in sonar-based mapping systems allowed for greater resolution of underwater terrain, yet certain areas of the lake continued to produce uneven or incomplete comparative results. Even with advanced acoustic imaging, environmental factors such as depth, sediment composition, and signal dispersion affected the clarity of returned data in specific regions. This created situations where newer scans provided more detail, but not always a fully consistent match with earlier datasets. Successive generations of bathymetric surveys sometimes revealed slight but notable differences in how specific underwater formations were represented across different mapping eras. These differences were not necessarily contradictions, but rather refinements that emerged as measurement precision increased. However, the persistence of variation across time meant that Lake Superior's underwater structure was not understood as a single static model, but as an evolving interpretation shaped by successive technological capabilities. Modern high-resolution scanning techniques have significantly improved the clarity of deep lakebed imaging, although historical data comparison still requires reconciliation between multiple survey layers. Contemporary mapping systems can capture fine-scale variations in underwater terrain that were previously undetectable, yet aligning these findings with older datasets requires careful calibration. This process often involves translating between different measurement standards, resolutions, and methodological assumptions used across decades of surveying practice. Variations in recorded depth interpretation across time highlight the complexity of producing a fully unified representation of Lake Superior's submerged landscape. Each era of mapping contributes a different level of detail, shaped by the limitations and strengths of its available technology. When combined, these records form a composite understanding that is more detailed than any single dataset, but also more complex to interpret as a single coherent model. Certain underwater zones demonstrate higher levels of measurement refinement difficulty due to their scale, depth transitions, and geological complexity beneath the water column. In these regions, subtle changes in underwater terrain can produce disproportionately large differences in how data is captured and interpreted. This creates localized areas where mapping consistency becomes more difficult to maintain across repeated survey efforts, even with improved instrumentation. Technological advancement in underwater mapping does not always produce perfectly linear improvements when applied retrospectively to earlier incomplete datasets. Instead, each new generation of tools often reveals both additional detail and new questions about how previous interpretations were constructed. This layered progression means that increased precision does not simply overwrite earlier uncertainty, but sometimes exposes where uncertainty was previously hidden within broader approximations. Differences between historical and modern lakebed models illustrate how environmental mapping systems evolve through correction rather than replacement of earlier interpretations. Rather than discarding earlier representations entirely, modern systems tend to refine and adjust them, creating a multi-generational record of how understanding has developed over time. In this sense, the mapping of Lake Superior is not a finished product, but an ongoing process of refinement shaped by technological evolution. What emerges from the full progression of Lake Superior's bathymetric records is not a contradiction of the lake's structure, but a layered evolution of how its submerged form has been progressively understood over time. Each dataset contributes a different level of clarity, and together they form an accumulated record of observation rather than a single, definitive snapshot. The lake remains physically unchanged, but the way it has been represented continues to shift as each generation of measurement adds another layer of definition. Lake Superior's deepest regions remain physically present and measurable, yet the way they are represented continues to shift as each new layer of mapping refines what the previous one could only partially define. Ghost ships, beneath the cold, Superior's preserved dead. Maritime preservation studies of cold freshwater shipwrecks consistently show that low temperatures combined with minimal salinity can significantly slow the chemical and biological processes responsible for structural decay. In controlled analyses comparing saltwater and freshwater environments, researchers have repeatedly observed that the absence of high salinity reduces corrosion rates in metal components, while cold temperatures limit bacterial activity that would normally accelerate the breakdown of organic materials. These conditions create an environment where submerged structures do not behave according to typical expectations of maritime loss, but instead follow a much slower trajectory of change that can extend across decades or even centuries. Maritime archaeologists documenting Great Lakes wreck sites have recorded instances where entire ship frameworks remain visually identifiable decades after sinking. These findings are not isolated anomalies but recurring outcomes observed across multiple survey missions conducted using sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles, and direct diving expeditions. The structural outlines of vessels often persist in recognizable form, including hull contours, deck framing, and in some cases internal compartments that remain partially intact despite long exposure to deep water conditions. Within this context, shipwrecks become less like dispersed debris fields and more like preserved historical objects resting in stable environmental conditions. During early deep water dives on major wreck locations, exploration teams frequently encountered vessel outlines that retained unexpected structural clarity. Divers involved in these missions have described the initial visual contact with wreck sites as moments of cognitive adjustment, where expectations of fragmentation are replaced by the observation of coherent structure still present on the lakebed. Although conditions vary depending on depth, sediment coverage, and local currents, many documented sites reveal surprising levels of preservation that challenge assumptions formed from saltwater wreck behaviour. These encounters have contributed to a growing body of evidence suggesting that freshwater environments under specific conditions can function as natural preservation systems. Preservation conditions in northern freshwater systems often prevent the rapid biological and chemical breakdown commonly seen in saltwater environments. Without high salinity to accelerate corrosion, metal components degrade at slower rates, while reduced microbial activity limits the decomposition of organic materials such as wood and textiles. In deep, cold environments, oxygen levels are often lower, further restricting processes that would typically contribute to rapid structural collapse. These combined factors create conditions in which submerged vessels can persist in recognizable states long after their operational lifespans have ended, preserving physical traces of maritime history in ways that are rare elsewhere. Repeated underwater surveys across multiple decades have produced consistent evidence that some shipwrecks remain remarkably stable in form despite long-term submersion. Survey data collected through sonar imaging and photogrammetry has shown that certain wrecks retain proportional integrity, allowing researchers to reconstruct vessel layouts with surprising accuracy. While sediment accumulation and biological growth can obscure details over time, the underlying structures often remain sufficiently intact to permit detailed mapping. This consistency across different sites has reinforced the view that freshwater preservation is not incidental but systematic under specific environmental conditions. In several documented recovery and mapping efforts, researchers observed that cargo holds, hull sections, and mechanical structures often remain partially intact. These preserved elements provide critical insight into the operational history of the vessels, revealing information about cargo distribution, construction methods, and damage patterns that occurred at the time of sinking. Even when external surfaces show signs of collapse or sediment coverage, internal frameworks can remain stable enough to support interpretation of how the vessel functioned prior to its final moments. This level of preservation allows shipwrecks to serve as physical records rather than merely archaeological remnants. Comparative analysis between marine and freshwater wreck sites has highlighted significant differences in how long submerged materials retain recognizable structure. In saltwater environments, corrosion and biological activity typically lead to accelerated fragmentation, often reducing shipwrecks to dispersed components within relatively shorter timeframes. By contrast, Freshwater systems with stable cold conditions demonstrate slower degradation rates, allowing structural elements to remain connected and identifiable for extended periods. These differences have been central to ongoing maritime research, particularly in regions where large inland lakes contain extensive historical records of shipping activity. Dive reports from professional recovery teams frequently describe moments where wreck interiors appear almost undisturbed by time and environmental erosion. Within these spaces, structural elements such as stairwells, bulkheads, and machinery housings can remain in positions that closely resemble their operational arrangement at the time of sinking. Although sediment intrusion and biological growth are common, they do not always eliminate the underlying architectural coherence of the vessel. These observations contribute to a broader understanding of how environmental conditions can preserve not only external hull forms, but also internal spatial organization. Sonar imaging and underwater documentation efforts have revealed shipwreck distributions that function collectively as a long-term historical archive. Rather than isolated incidents of maritime loss, these wreck sites form a distributed record of shipping activity, industrial expansion, and navigational history across the Great Lakes region. Each documented wreck contributes additional data points that allow researchers to reconstruct patterns of trade routes, ship construction practices, and historical accident conditions. In this sense, submerged wrecks serve as preserved material evidence of economic and technological development over time. Ongoing research into submerged vessel sites has raised questions about how environmental stability alters expectations of maritime loss and disappearance. Traditional assumptions about shipwrecks often rely on the idea of rapid decay and disappearance beneath the surface, yet empirical evidence from freshwater systems demonstrates that this process can be significantly delayed or altered. As a result, investigators must account for the possibility that submerged objects may persist in recognizable form far longer than previously assumed. This challenges earlier frameworks used to interpret maritime disasters and requires a more nuanced understanding of underwater preservation dynamics. Despite technological advancements in deepwater surveying, many wreck sites continue to resist full historical reconstruction due to incomplete physical and contextual evidence. While sonar mapping and remote imaging have improved the ability to locate and document submerged structures, gaps remain in understanding exact sinking conditions, structural failures, and final moments before submersion. Sediment coverage, environmental shifts, and limited historical records can all contribute to incomplete interpretations. As a result, even well-preserved wrecks may still contain unanswered questions about the events that led to their resting place. Some wreck sites remain so well preserved that determining where disappearance ends and persistence begins becomes increasingly uncertain. Lake Michigan and the Vanishing Triangle. Transportation safety archives contain repeated records of routine operations alongside documented gaps where incident details were never fully completed or submitted. Within these records, investigators and historians reviewing decades of transportation data across the Great Lakes system have often noted that the presence of missing or incomplete documentation does not always indicate unusual circumstances, but rather reflects the limitations of record-keeping practices in earlier periods when reporting standards varied significantly between agencies, operators, and jurisdictions. In some cases, entire incident timelines were reconstructed only after secondary reports surfaced from newspapers, local authorities, or survivor accounts, creating a fragmented historical record that requires careful interpretation rather than straightforward reading. Historical data sets compiled from accident and disappearance reports eventually produced a recurring classification that researchers later labeled the Lake Michigan Triangle. This label did not originate from a formal scientific designation, but instead emerged through retrospective grouping of incidents that appeared geographically clustered when plotted across maps and timelines. Over time, this interpretive framework gained visibility in media discussions and informal analysis, where the combination of multiple unrelated events began to be discussed as a single phenomenon. Despite this, official documentation does not recognize the triangle as a distinct navigational zone, instead treating each recorded incident as an individual case with its own contributing factors. Aviation and vessel incident records, when analysed together, include multiple cases that were later grouped into a shared triangular interpretive framework. These cases span different decades and involve varying circumstances, including mechanical failure, weather-related complications, and navigational error, with each incident originally documented independently before being retrospectively associated through geographic mapping. The process of grouping these events does not imply a shared cause, but it does reveal how human interpretation tends to organize scattered data into recognizable shapes when viewed from a distance in time. This tendency becomes especially pronounced when incidents are plotted within confined geographic boundaries that contain heavy transportation activity. Commercial navigation logs frequently document abrupt visibility loss and sudden atmospheric changes that disrupted planned transit schedules. These conditions, while not unique to Lake Michigan, are particularly notable in inland water systems where temperature differentials between land and water can produce rapid fog formation and shifting wind patterns that reduce visibility with limited warning. Meteorological studies of the region consistently identify rapid fog development and localized wind shifts as recurring environmental conditions that can alter visibility within short time spans. These transitions are often the result of temperature differences between the lake surface and surrounding land, creating instability zones that affect navigation without warning consistency. Historical records from shipping operators describe instances where routes that began under clear conditions transitioned quickly into disorientation, requiring crews to rely on instrumentation and estimation rather than direct visual navigation. Such environmental variability is a documented feature of the region's climate behavior, rather than an unexplained anomaly. Long-term archival comparison shows that unrelated incidents can appear spatially connected when reorganized retrospectively across multiple decades of reporting. When data is plotted using consistent geographic frameworks, clusters may emerge simply due to the density of traffic in certain corridors, where both commercial shipping and aviation routes are heavily concentrated. This effect is amplified when incomplete records are included in the analysis, as missing contextual details can make separate events appear more closely related than they were in operational reality. As a result, patterns perceived in hindsight may reflect the structure of data organization as much as the events themselves. Sequential reconstruction of documented losses demonstrates how individual cases were later reinterpreted as part of a broader perceived pattern rather than isolated events. In several documented examples, incidents that occurred years apart and under different operational conditions were later discussed together in secondary literature, often without full reference to their distinct causes or investigative conclusions. This process of reinterpretation does not alter the original findings of official reports, but it does influence how the public perceives relationships between events when they are viewed collectively rather than individually. Lake Michigan's transportation system is characterized by a high density of overlapping commercial and aviation routes, which increases the likelihood that unrelated incidents will occur within similar geographic proximity. When viewed on long-range mapping systems, this concentration can produce visual clusters that appear significant, even when no operational connection exists between events. Official investigation files confirm that recorded incidents include mechanical failures, environmental disruptions, and communication breakdowns across separate operational contexts. These categories represent the primary causes identified in maritime and aviation investigations throughout the region, with mechanical issues ranging from engine failure to structural malfunction, and environmental disruptions including sudden weather shifts, reduced visibility, and turbulent wind conditions. Communication breakdowns, particularly in earlier periods, were often the result of limited technology rather than the absence of distress, complicating later reconstruction efforts. Incomplete transmission logs and missing witness accounts have led to reconstructed timelines that rely heavily on partial or fragmented evidence chains. In many historical cases, investigators were required to assemble sequences of events using indirect indicators such as last known positions, scheduled route expectations, and delayed or secondary communications received after incidents occurred. This method of reconstruction is standard in transportation investigation, but it inherently introduces uncertainty when primary data sources are absent or disrupted, leaving certain aspects of incidents open to interpretation rather than a definitive conclusion. Meteorological studies of inland navigation systems consistently identify rapid fog formation, wind shifts, and sudden weather transitions as recurring operational hazards. These atmospheric conditions are particularly relevant in regions where large bodies of water interact with surrounding land masses, producing localized weather instability that can affect visibility and vessel control within short time spans. While these phenomena are well understood within meteorological science, their impact on navigation continues to require careful monitoring due to their speed of onset and variability across different sections of water routes. Scholarly analysis of historical reporting practices indicates that repeated documentation of isolated events can unintentionally reinforce perceptions of geographic clustering. When incidents are recorded independently, but later compiled into aggregated studies or public narratives, the act of grouping itself can create an impression of connection that was not present in the original operational context. This effect is especially pronounced when maps or visual representations are used to display incident locations, as spatial proximity can suggest relational patterns even in the absence of shared causation. A comprehensive review of documented cases has not established a definitive framework that clearly separates coincidence, environmental conditions, and retrospective pattern formation. Despite extensive investigation into individual incidents across aviation and maritime records, no single explanatory model accounts for all recorded cases attributed to the Lake Michigan Triangle concept. Instead, findings consistently point toward a combination of high traffic density, variable weather conditions, incomplete historical records, and interpretive clustering as contributing factors in how these events are understood. When historical records are incomplete or reconstructed from secondary sources, spatial patterns can appear more structured than the original events actually were. This effect becomes stronger when incidents are plotted across long time spans without consistent reporting standards, leading to interpretive frameworks that reflect data organization as much as operational reality. The Lake Michigan Triangle endures as an interpretive construct shaped more by how scattered incidents were later organized than by any verified anomaly within the records themselves. The Lady Elgin disaster. Hours before the collision that would define its legacy, passenger records from the SS Lady Elgin indicate a return voyage carrying excursion travellers back toward Chicago after an evening of scheduled activity. The vessel itself was operating as part of a well-established passenger route across Lake Michigan in 1860, a period when excursion travel by steamship had become a common form of both transportation and leisure for communities along the shoreline. On that night, the Lady Elgin carried passengers who had spent hours at a gathering in Milwaukee, now boarding for the return journey under conditions that, at the time of departure, did not immediately suggest impending catastrophe. Maritime travel in this era relied heavily on visual navigation, basic mechanical systems, and the judgment of crew members interpreting shifting conditions without the technological aids that would later define safer operations at sea. Minutes prior to the incident, shifting wind conditions began affecting vessel movement and reducing reliable visibility between ships operating in shared transit space. Weather patterns across Lake Michigan were known for rapid transitions, and accounts from the period describe how conditions that began relatively calm could quickly deteriorate as wind intensity increased and visibility decreased, particularly during evening hours when natural light was already fading. These environmental changes did not always present themselves as immediate threats, but rather as gradual reductions in clarity that made navigation increasingly dependent on proximity awareness and experience. In such conditions, even experienced crews faced heightened difficulty in maintaining safe separation between vessels travelling intersecting or parallel routes. Structural and navigational accounts associated with the SS Lady Elgin later describe an unexpected interaction with the schooner Augusta that resulted in catastrophic damage to both vessels. Historical records confirm that the Lady Elgin collided with the Augusta during nighttime navigation, an event that initiated a chain of structural failures leading to the rapid sinking of the passenger vessel. The impact compromised the integrity of the Lady Elgin's hull, allowing water to enter the ship at a rate that exceeded the crew's ability to manage damage control using the resources available at the time. The collision itself became the defining moment of the disaster, but the consequences unfolded in the minutes that followed with far greater severity than the initial impact suggested. Immediately following impact, onboard conditions shifted rapidly as darkness and structural failure disrupted normal movement across passenger and crew areas. As water intrusion increased and stability diminished, the internal environment of the vessel would have transitioned from controlled motion to instability, where movement became increasingly difficult and spatial orientation unreliable. steamship construction of the period provided limited compartmentalization compared to later safety standards, meaning that once structural integrity was compromised, flooding could spread quickly through multiple sections of the vessel. In such conditions, even basic navigation within the ship became a challenge, as familiar pathways and functional systems were disrupted by the physical consequences of the collision. Surviving accounts collected afterward describe moments of confusion where passengers and crew attempted to interpret unfolding events without clear visual reference points. Testimonies from survivors of the Lady Elgin disaster emphasized the suddenness with which ordinary travel conditions transformed into emergency response scenarios, where instructions, movement, and communication were all constrained by darkness and structural instability. The absence of clear external visibility intensified internal uncertainty, making it difficult for individuals to assess the scale of damage or the direction of potential safety. In these moments, decision-making occurred under conditions of limited information, where perception was shaped more by immediate surroundings than by a full understanding of the situation. Rescue coordination efforts documented in later reports indicate that response capacity was limited by distance, timing, and rapidly deteriorating situational awareness. Unlike modern coordinated emergency systems, mid-19th century maritime rescue operations depended on nearby vessels, shoreline observation, and delayed communication, all of which constrained the speed and effectiveness of response efforts. By the time assistance could be organised and directed toward the scene, the critical window for immediate survival had already narrowed significantly. These limitations played a central role in shaping the scale of loss associated with the Lady Elgin disaster, as timing and accessibility directly influenced the number of individuals who could be reached in time. Communication fragments and shoreline observations recorded after the event suggest that initial awareness of the scale of disaster developed only after critical delays. Reports from observers along the shoreline and from vessels in the vicinity indicate that understanding of the full extent of the sinking emerged gradually rather than immediately, as information became available in fragmented and incomplete forms. This delay in situational awareness meant that the magnitude of the incident was not fully recognised until after significant loss had already occurred. In maritime disasters of this period, such delays were not uncommon, as information transfer relied on physical proximity and observation, rather than real-time communication systems. Historical casualty estimates compiled from official investigations identify the SS Lady Elgin disaster as one of the deadliest maritime tragedies in Great Lakes history. The sinking resulted in the loss of hundreds of lives, with estimates commonly placing the death toll at over 300 passengers and crew, making it one of the most severe single-vessel disasters in the region's recorded history. The scale of loss shocked contemporaries not only because of the number of casualties, but also because of the speed with which the event unfolded following the collision. In historical context, the Lady Elgin disaster became a defining example of how quickly maritime conditions could shift from routine travel to large-scale tragedy. Newspaper reports and public documentation following the sinking describe widespread shock as fragmented information gradually revealed the extent of loss. Contemporary accounts circulated through print media, often relying on partial reports from survivors, witnesses, and arriving vessels, which contributed to a developing public understanding of the disaster over time rather than immediately after its occurrence. The emotional response recorded in these accounts reflects both the scale of human loss and the suddenness of the event, which challenged assumptions about safety and passenger steamship travel. As details emerged, public attention increasingly focused on both the human cost and the conditions that allowed such a rapid escalation of disaster. Maritime safety evaluations conducted in the aftermath examined procedural limitations that influenced response time and recovery operations during the incident. Although formalised safety regulations were limited compared to modern standards, the disaster prompted renewed attention to navigation practices, vessel spacing, and the challenges of nighttime travel on busy waterways. Investigations considered how environmental conditions, operational decisions, and technological constraints combined to produce circumstances in which collision risk increased significantly. These assessments contributed to broader discussions about maritime safety development in the Great Lakes region during the latter half of the 19th century. Long-term historical assessments of the SS Lady Elgin disaster continue to emphasize how rapidly structural failure and human response diverged in the critical moments of the event. The sequence from collision to sinking unfolded in a time frame that left minimal opportunity for organised evacuation or coordinated rescue, highlighting the narrow margin between survivable incident and irreversible catastrophe in maritime environments of the period. Over time, the disasters remained a reference point in historical studies of Great Lakes shipping, not only for its scale, but for the way in which timing, visibility, and structural vulnerability converged in a single unfolding moment. By the time the full reality of the SS Lady Elgin disaster became understood, the moment in which it could have been changed had already passed completely out of reach. The Lake Erie tempests that trapped sailors. Expectations formed during routine inland crossings often fail to account for how abruptly stable conditions can dissolve without gradual warning signs. In operational history across inland navigation routes, recorded voyages frequently began under conditions considered manageable and well within standard risk margins, yet documentation from multiple incidents shows that this perceived stability could shift without the kind of progressive indicators that crews were trained to rely on. This gap between expectation and actual change becomes significant in understanding why experienced operators sometimes described events not as gradual deterioration, but as sudden discontinuities in the environment they were navigating through. Moments of transition between calm movement and disruption have been documented as some of the least predictable phases in inland navigation history. These transitional phases do not always present themselves as distinct meteorological events, but rather as compressed intervals where multiple minor shifts align in ways that alter overall conditions faster than anticipated. Historical accounts emphasize that it is often not the presence of a single dominant force that defines these moments, but the convergence of smaller changes that collectively reshape navigational stability in a short span of time. Decisions made during early stages of reduced visibility frequently determine whether vessels maintain control or lose directional reference entirely. In many recorded inland incidents, the initial response to declining visibility involves continuation under adjusted assumptions rather than immediate cessation or rerouting, reflecting both operational pressure and limited alternative options in real-time navigation. Once visual reference points begin to degrade, the margin for corrective action narrows significantly, and decision-making becomes increasingly dependent on instruments and estimation rather than direct observation. Perceptual stability during navigation depends heavily on continuous visual cues that can disappear within extremely short time intervals. When these cues are interrupted, even briefly, the human ability to maintain spatial orientation can be challenged, particularly in environments where external reference points are already minimal or inconsistent. In inland water systems, where horizons can appear uniform and indistinct under certain conditions, the sudden loss of visual differentiation can create a perception of uniformity that complicates directional judgment. Interruptions in forward progress across open water routes often occur before measurable environmental escalation is fully recognized by onboard observers. This phenomenon has been noted in multiple case studies, where vessel movement continued under the assumption of manageable conditions, only for subsequent developments to reveal that critical thresholds had already been crossed. The lag between environmental change and human recognition plays a central role in how quickly situations evolve beyond standard control parameters. Human response delays in shifting conditions are often amplified when available reference points cease to provide reliable orientation feedback. In such scenarios, even trained personnel may experience hesitation not due to lack of knowledge, but due to the sudden absence of confirmatory signals that normally guide corrective action. This delay can compound initial uncertainty, allowing conditions to evolve further before intervention strategies are fully implemented. Loss of directional certainty has been recorded as a critical factor in multiple inland incidents, where movement continued without clear navigational confirmation. In these situations, progression does not necessarily stop, but it becomes increasingly detached from intended routing, creating divergence between planned and actual position over time. The absence of immediate corrective awareness can result in compounding deviation, particularly when external conditions limit verification of course accuracy. Escalation phases in confined navigation zones tend to compress multiple operational challenges into overlapping moments of reduced control. Rather than isolated problems emerging sequentially, conditions such as reduced visibility, directional uncertainty and response delay can interact simultaneously, creating compounded difficulty within a short temporal window. This compression effect is particularly significant in inland environments, where spatial boundaries limit the ability to reposition or avoid developing conditions. Instrument reliance increases sharply when external visual confirmation becomes inconsistent or partially obscured during active transit. Navigation systems and onboard instruments become primary sources of orientation, but their effectiveness depends on interpretation and the quality of available input data. In historical contexts where instrumentation was less advanced than modern systems, this reliance often introduced additional layers of uncertainty when cross-referencing between visual and mechanical indicators became difficult. Situational awareness breakdowns typically occur when multiple small disruptions accumulate faster than corrective actions can be executed. Rather than a single catastrophic trigger, these breakdowns are often the result of incremental loss of clarity across several operational domains, including visibility, timing, and environmental interpretation. Once cumulative disruption exceeds response capacity, maintaining coordinated control becomes increasingly difficult. Repeated inland navigation case studies indicate that constrained movement episodes often emerge from timing mismatches rather than single identifiable failures. These mismatches occur when environmental change, human response, and mechanical adaptation do not align within the same operational window, creating brief periods where corrective action is no longer synchronized with evolving conditions. Over time, these episodes have been recognized as a recurring feature in inland navigation risk assessments. In inland waters where conditions shift faster than perception can adjust, control is often lost not in a single moment, but in the brief gap between recognition and response. Lake Huron's deadly. November waters. Late-season navigation schedules across the Great Lakes consistently compress operational timelines as shipping routes approach winter closure periods. In commercial maritime planning, this phase of the year is not treated as an abrupt transition, but as a narrowing window in which vessels must complete assigned routes before ice formation, and seasonal restrictions begin to limit movement. Within this operational structure, timing becomes as significant as environmental conditions, because delays that might be manageable earlier in the year can carry greater consequences when the navigation season is nearing its end. In Lake Huron's operational records, late-season navigation is consistently associated with a narrowing margin between safe transit conditions and the onset of environmental restrictions. This period does not introduce new hazards by definition, but instead reduces the buffer time available for correcting delays once weather conditions begin to shift. Transitional months between autumn and winter introduce overlapping atmospheric conditions that increase variability in wind and wave behavior across inland water routes. Meteorological systems during this period do not shift in isolation, but often intersect in ways that produce rapid alternation between stable and unstable conditions within short time spans. These overlapping patterns are particularly significant in large freshwater basins, where the absence of fixed oceanic consistency allows localized atmospheric changes to influence surface behavior more directly and with less predictability over short intervals. Meteorological transitions in this region often occur without gradual stabilization phases, meaning that atmospheric systems can move directly from moderate conditions into high variability states within short intervals. This lack of transitional consistency increases the difficulty of predicting surface behavior with extended lead times. Commercial freight operations during late autumn often continue under time-sensitive constraints that prioritize completion of shipments before seasonal shutdowns. Bulk carriers operating during this period frequently carry materials essential to industrial supply chains, creating operational pressure that extends navigation activity deeper into the transitional season. This continued movement, while routine in logistical terms, places vessels in environments where environmental volatility is increasing, even as operational urgency remains constant. Operational continuity during this period is maintained through scheduling systems that prioritize cargo completion timelines, which can reduce available flexibility for route deviation once voyages are underway. This creates a structured environment where navigation decisions are influenced simultaneously by environmental conditions and logistical constraints. Convergence of cold air masses with remaining warm surface water can produce rapid instability in large enclosed freshwater basins during seasonal transitions. This interaction between temperature systems does not require extreme conditions to generate significant surface disruption, as even moderate contrasts can influence wind intensity and wave formation when sustained over a sufficient distance. In large inland bodies of water, this convergence can occur repeatedly during late-year atmospheric cycles, contributing to conditions that shift more quickly than seasonal expectations might suggest. Freighter movement during extended shipping seasons places additional strain on vessels operating under increasingly unpredictable environmental timing windows. Ships designed for bulk transport are engineered for stability and capacity, but operational efficiency during late-season voyages often depends on maintaining schedules that leave limited flexibility for environmental delays. When combined with shifting atmospheric conditions, this creates a navigational context in which operational planning must account for both mechanical capability and rapidly changing external factors. Recurrent timing patterns observed in late-year navigation incidents suggest that certain operational periods carry consistently elevated exposure to rapid environmental change. Historical records of maritime activity in the Great Lakes region show that incidents are not evenly distributed across the calendar year, but tend to cluster around transitional periods where seasonal atmospheric systems are in flux. This clustering does not indicate a single cause, but rather highlights the intersection of environmental variability and sustained operational activity during specific months. Temporal clustering in historical maritime records is often reinforced by the concentration of shipping activity during predictable seasonal windows, particularly when multiple vessels operate under similar environmental exposure conditions within the same transitional timeframe. This overlap can amplify the appearance of pattern formation when data is reviewed retrospectively. Wave amplification in large inland basins becomes significantly more pronounced when wind duration aligns with unobstructed surface distance across open water. In these conditions, wind energy transfers across extended fetch distances, allowing wave systems to build in height and intensity without interruption from land barriers. This process can produce surface conditions that escalate quickly once a threshold of sustained wind input is reached, particularly in basins where depth and shoreline orientation support rapid wave development. Operational decision-making under seasonal pressure often involves balancing navigational caution against the necessity of maintaining scheduled transport continuity. Vessel operators working within commercial frameworks must consider weather forecasts, transit timing, cargo obligations, and port scheduling simultaneously, which can limit the flexibility of route adjustment once a voyage has begun. In late-season conditions, this balance becomes more constrained as available time windows narrow and environmental variability increases. Escalating atmospheric shifts during November, conditions frequently compress multiple environmental changes into short, overlapping intervals of instability. Rather than progressing through clearly separated stages, these shifts can occur in rapid succession, creating situations where visibility, wind strength, and wave behavior change within tightly condensed time frames. This compression effect is a defining feature of seasonal transition periods in inland water systems, where atmospheric systems can reorganize quickly across large but confined bodies of water. Frequent alignment of seasonal transition periods with recorded maritime losses has led to increased focus on timing rather than isolated environmental triggers. When incidents are reviewed collectively, the temporal clustering of events during specific seasonal windows becomes a notable feature of historical records, even when individual cases differ in cause and circumstance. This observation has encouraged further examination of how operational timing interacts with environmental variability, particularly during periods when navigation activity continues under increasing atmospheric instability. Repeated convergence of seasonal closure cycles and adverse navigation conditions continues to raise unresolved questions about temporal vulnerability in inland shipping routes. The overlap between operational deadlines and shifting environmental systems creates a context in which certain periods carry heightened complexity, not due to a single dominant factor, but due to the interaction of multiple changing variables within a constrained time frame. Across Lake Huron's late-season crossings, the same November conditions have aligned with both uneventful passages and fatal disruptions, without any single visible change in circumstances to explain the difference. The Griffin, America's first Great Lakes mystery, early European movement into the interior waterways of North America, introduced navigation routes that were only partially understood at the time of their first recorded use. these routes were not defined by established maritime charts in the way later shipping corridors would be, but instead by exploratory interpretation of vast inland waters whose scale and behaviour were still being documented through direct observation. Within this context, early navigation was as much an exercise in interpretation as it was in travel, where shoreline recognition and directional estimation formed the basis of movement across regions that had not yet been systematically mapped. Surviving expedition narratives describe the construction and deployment of one of the earliest known sailing vessels to operate within the Upper Great Lakes region. This vessel, known historically as the Le Griffon, was built under the direction of René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, during his exploration efforts in the late 17th century. Contemporary accounts indicate that the ship represented a significant development in inland exploration capability at the time, enabling deeper access into regions that had previously been difficult to traverse by water due to distance, conditions, and limited logistical support. Continuity between departure points and confirmed arrival locations becomes increasingly uncertain when comparing surviving written accounts of the same voyage. Historical records describe the Le Griffon departing from the Upper Great Lakes region with cargo and supplies, yet no universally accepted documentation confirms its successful return or arrival at a definitive destination. This gap in continuity does not present itself as a single missing record, but rather as a discontinuity between references that suggest movement and the absence of corresponding confirmation after a certain point in the voyage. Later historical writings that reference the final stages of the expedition diverge in key details, producing inconsistencies that have never been fully reconciled. Some accounts suggest that the vessel may have been lost during its return journey, while others propose alternative sequences of events involving stops, delays, or possible encounters that were not consistently recorded across sources. These variations do not converge into a single agreed narrative, and instead form a range of interpretations that reflect the limitations of communication and documentation during early exploration periods. Navigational practice during the earliest phases of Great Lakes exploration relied on limited cartographic reference points and incomplete shoreline mapping. Early explorers often depended on observational navigation, using visible land features, estimated distances, and compass direction rather than detailed charts. In such conditions, even experienced navigators faced uncertainty when crossing large inland waters whose full geographic structure was not yet accurately represented in available mapping resources. Interpretations of the expedition's final movement vary significantly, depending on whether they originate from first-hand reports or retrospective historical compilations. First-hand accounts, where available, tend to focus on immediate observations and logistical details, while later compilations attempt to assemble fragmented information into coherent sequences of events. The divergence between these two forms of historical recording has contributed to ongoing uncertainty regarding the precise conclusion of the Le Griffon's final voyage. No verified documentation confirms the final physical condition or precise location of the vessel after its last recorded departure. This absence of confirmation has remained consistent across centuries of historical inquiry, despite repeated efforts to identify wreck sites or reconstruct the final trajectory of the expedition. The lack of physical evidence means that conclusions about the vessel's fate remain dependent on interpretation rather than direct verification. Centuries of historical inquiry have attempted to reconstruct the final sequence of events, using fragmented references scattered across unrelated sources. Researchers have examined expedition logs, secondary references, oral traditions, and later historical analyses in an effort to assemble a coherent narrative. However, these materials do not converge into a single definitive account, and instead highlight the degree to which early documentation practices were insufficient for complete reconstruction of certain exploratory events. Environmental and operational constraints of early inland sailing introduced uncertainties that were rarely documented with sufficient detail for later verification. Weather conditions, navigational limitations, and logistical constraints all played roles in shaping the outcomes of voyages during this period. Yet the lack of systematic recording means that many of these factors cannot be precisely reconstructed. As a result, modern understanding of such expeditions must account for both the known elements and the significant gaps in recorded information. Oral traditions and secondary accounts preserve alternative versions of the vessel's fate that exist alongside, but not fully aligned with, written records. These narratives vary in detail and emphasis, often reflecting the perspectives of later observers rather than direct witnesses. While they contribute to the broader historical memory of the Le Griffon, they do not resolve the inconsistencies present in primary documentation, instead adding additional layers of interpretation to an already incomplete record. Across all surviving references, the absence of a definitive endpoint has become as significant as any detail recorded during the expedition itself. The lack of closure in the historical record has ensured that the Le Griffon remains a subject of continued study and interpretation, not because of what is known with certainty, but because of what has never been conclusively documented. The expedition ends in written history at the exact moment where every surviving account stops agreeing on what could still be verified. Lake Ontario and the wrecks lost to silence. In large inland transportation corridors, the distribution of recorded incidents often reflects not only what occurred, but also how consistently those events were formally preserved across reporting systems. Within maritime operations, the act of recording an event is not identical to the act of narrating it, and this distinction becomes increasingly visible when comparing incidents that share similar operational conditions but differ in how extensively they were later documented. In the case of Lake Ontario, this creates a layered historical record where some events appear fully developed in public memory, while others remain confined to brief operational summaries that offer limited narrative expansion. Recorded maritime losses within Lake Ontario shipping routes show uneven levels of narrative expansion, even when incidents occur under comparable operational conditions. This unevenness does not necessarily reflect differences in severity alone, but rather variations in how information was transmitted, archived, and later revisited by historical or institutional sources. Some losses enter broader maritime discourse through repeated referencing, while others remain anchored in technical documentation that preserves only essential operational facts without extended interpretive detail. Between official incident summaries and expanded historical accounts, measurable differences emerge in how detail is retained, expanded, or omitted over time. These differences are shaped by the pathways through which information moves from initial reporting to archival storage and eventually into historical interpretation. In many cases, the transformation from operational record to historical narrative depends on secondary attention rather than initial documentation, meaning that some events accumulate detail through repeated referencing, while others remain static in their recorded form. In several recorded cases from the Lake Ontario shipping region, incident descriptions remain confined to brief operational entries rather than extended investigative narratives. These entries typically confirm essential facts such as occurrence, general location, and vessel identification when available, but do not always expand into reconstructed timelines or broader contextual analysis. As a result, certain maritime losses exist in a documented but minimally elaborated form, where the presence of record does not correspond to the presence of narrative depth. Structural differences in documentation practices across jurisdictions have influenced how maritime events are preserved within regional and national historical records. Variations in reporting standards, archival priorities, and institutional focus can result in inconsistent levels of detail being retained for incidents that are otherwise similar in operational context. Over time, these structural differences accumulate, producing a historical landscape where some events are heavily documented and others remain comparatively underdeveloped in public records. Patterns of archival preservation demonstrate that not all maritime incidents receive equivalent depth of reconstruction, even when occurring under comparable navigational conditions. This disparity becomes more pronounced when examining long-term historical collections, where some events are revisited, reinterpreted, and expanded through secondary analysis, while others remain unchanged from their original recorded form. The result is a layered archive in which visibility is not solely determined by occurrence, but also by the degree of subsequent attention. Constraints in underwater recovery operations within Lake Ontario have limited the extent to which physical verification of certain historical wreck sites has been achieved. Factors such as depth variation, sediment accumulation, and underwater visibility conditions can all affect the ability to locate, identify, or fully document submerged structures. In some cases, these limitations mean that physical evidence remains partially inaccessible, leaving certain incidents documented primarily through surface-level records rather than complete underwater confirmation. Depth variation and sediment conditions in inland freshwater systems can affect both detection capabilities and long-term visibility of submerged maritime structures. Unlike more uniform environments, inland lakes can contain localized geological variations that influence how wreckage settles and how easily it can later be identified. These environmental factors contribute to differences in recovery outcomes, where some sites are more readily documented while others remain difficult to fully reconstruct through physical exploration. Public historical awareness of maritime losses often concentrates around events with broader media transmission rather than those confined to technical reporting records. Incidents that receive wider dissemination tend to accumulate additional interpretive material over time, while those limited to operational documentation may remain largely absent from collective memory. This creates a separation between recorded existence and public recognition, where some events are widely known and others remain largely within institutional archives. Differences in institutional recording practices contribute to uneven representation of maritime incidents across otherwise comparable operational environments. The manner in which events are categorized, summarized, and stored can influence whether they are later revisited or expanded in historical analysis. Over time, these procedural differences shape the structure of maritime history itself, determining not only what is preserved, but how extensively it is interpreted. Some maritime events persist only within operational records that confirm their occurrence, without ever developing the level of public narrative detail that transforms them into widely recognized history. Lake Ontario's disputed wreck identities beneath shipping corridors. Early maritime record-keeping along Lake Ontario's shipping corridors relied on limited positional accuracy and incomplete identification systems for documenting underwater wreck locations. Documentation practices in the earliest phases of organized inland navigation were primarily designed for surface reference, meaning that submerged hazards were often recorded through approximations rather than precise spatial mapping. In many cases, wreck reports were constructed from eyewitness accounts, partial recovery observations, or post-incident estimations that reflected the limitations of the available reporting tools at the time. Initial surveys conducted in heavily trafficked sections of Lake Ontario often recorded wreck positions using reference points that lacked the precision available in later mapping technologies. Shoreline landmarks, compass bearings, and estimated distances from known navigation routes were commonly used to describe underwater locations, resulting in positional descriptions that were useful for general awareness but not for exact relocation. As shipping activity increased, so did the need for more standardized methods of documenting submerged hazards, yet early records still retained a degree of spatial ambiguity. When submerged wreck sites were later revisited using improved detection methods, some physical remains did not align perfectly with earlier recorded positional estimates. Advancements in sonar imaging and underwater scanning revealed that certain wreck locations appeared slightly offset from their historically documented coordinates. These differences did not necessarily indicate errors in observation, but rather highlighted the gap between estimated reporting conditions and later high-resolution measurement capabilities. Archaeological interpretations of underwater wreckage in Lake Ontario have occasionally required revision as newer survey data introduced additional contextual detail. As underwater archaeology developed into a more structured discipline, researchers began comparing historical maritime logs with physical survey evidence, often leading to refinements in identification assumptions. In some cases, wreck fragments initially attributed to a specific vessel required re-evaluation when additional material evidence or improved imaging resolution became available. Certain wreck sites identified in early documentation have undergone classification adjustments as comparative analysis between historical records and physical findings progressed. These adjustments reflect the evolving nature of maritime archaeology, where identification is not always fixed at the point of discovery, but may change as additional contextual layers are introduced. The process of classification often involves cross-referencing ship registries, construction records, and structural characteristics observed in underwater remains. Advancements in sonar imaging and underwater survey systems allowed for more precise mapping of submerged structures, revealing inconsistencies in earlier wreck identification frameworks. High-resolution scans provided greater clarity of debris fields, hull fragments, and structural orientation, enabling more detailed comparisons with historical ship specifications. However, increased precision also introduced new interpretive challenges, particularly when earlier records lacked sufficient detail for direct one-to-one confirmation. Some underwater debris fields associated with historical shipping activity contain overlapping material characteristics that complicate straightforward classification into a single vessel origin. In environments with dense maritime traffic history, multiple wrecks and fragmented remains may exist within close proximity, creating conditions where material attribution requires careful separation of overlapping evidence. This complexity becomes especially relevant in corridors where long-term shipping activity has produced layered archaeological deposits. Differences between archival maritime registries and modern underwater survey interpretations highlight the evolving nature of wreck identification methodologies over time. Historical registries were often compiled under operational conditions that prioritized reporting efficiency over analytical precision, whereas modern interpretations benefit from detailed imaging and computational analysis. The result is a layered record in which identity attribution can shift depending on which dataset is prioritized. Reassessment of previously catalogued wreck locations has in certain cases resulted in modified or disputed identification outcomes within official records. These revisions typically arise when new survey data introduces additional clarity that was not available during earlier classification efforts. Rather than invalidating previous records, these updates often exist alongside them, creating a parallel record of interpretation that reflects different stages of investigative capability. The process of reconciling historical documentation with physical underwater evidence often requires layered interpretation rather than direct one-to-one confirmation. In practice, this means that wreck identification is treated as an evolving conclusion, supported by multiple forms of evidence, rather than a fixed assignment. This approach allows for the integration of both historical context and modern technological findings, even when they do not align perfectly. Modern survey systems consistently locate submerged wreck sites through high-resolution imaging, yet the way these wrecks are categorized depends on shifting interpretive standards used across different eras of maritime documentation. Classification frameworks in maritime archaeology are not static, and each generation of survey technology introduces adjustments to how previously identified wrecks are verified and recorded. This means that physical discovery and administrative classification do not always progress at the same pace, creating layered records where interpretation evolves alongside measurement capability. Over time, this results in a system where certainty applies to location, but not always to categorical identity. Lake Ontario's submerged wrecks remain physically fixed on the lakebed, yet their recorded identities continue to change as historical archives and modern survey interpretations are continually reconciled against each other. Crater Lake, beauty above, death below. Volcanic collapse events occurring thousands of years ago created a geological basin whose formation permanently removed any direct connection to the surrounding river systems. In the case of Crater Lake in Oregon, this origin is not a gradual accumulation of water over time, but the result of Mount Mazama's massive eruption and subsequent structural collapse, which left behind a caldera that slowly filled with precipitation and snowmelt. The absence of inflow and outflow rivers gives the lake a closed structure that behaves differently from most freshwater systems, where continuous movement and exchange typically shape environmental balance. Geometric depth measurements taken within caldera lakes reveal vertical dimensions that exceed typical expectations formed by surface observation alone. Crater Lake reaches depths of approximately 1,943 feet, or about 594 meters, making it one of the deepest lakes in the United States, and this extreme vertical scale creates a layered water column that is not easily understood through surface-level viewing. The sheer depth means that conditions at the lower levels exist in a state largely separated from human visual perception, reinforcing a sense of separation between what is seen and what is physically present below. Visual interpretation of still water surfaces can produce a misleading sense of stability when the underlying structure extends far beyond perceptible range. At Crater Lake, the surface often appears calm and undisturbed, reflecting surrounding cliffs and sky with a clarity that can obscure the true scale beneath it. This visual stillness is not an indication of shallowness or uniformity, but rather the result of minimal external sediment input and the lake's isolated hydrological structure, which allows light penetration and clarity under conditions that differ significantly from more turbulent freshwater systems. Isolated inland basins formed through volcanic activity often develop environmental conditions that differ significantly between surface perception and subsurface reality. Crater Lake's environment is shaped not only by its depth, but also by its steep enclosing walls, which rise sharply from the waterline and form a near-vertical boundary between surface and surrounding terrain. This structure limits gradual transition zones, creating instead a direct contrast between visible calm water and the abrupt geological containment that defines the caldera itself. Access routes surrounding steep caldera formations impose physical limitations that restrict direct human movement toward lower elevation zones. At Crater Lake, most observation occurs from elevated rim positions, where viewpoints allow visibility across the entire basin without requiring descent into the interior slopes. The steepness of the caldera walls makes direct access to the waterline challenging in many areas, reinforcing a separation between observation and physical contact with the lake's deeper environment. Scientific observation within enclosed volcanic lakes frequently requires specialized equipment due to depth, temperature, and structural constraints. Research conducted at Crater Lake has utilized sonar mapping, submersible instruments, and remote sensing technologies to understand the lake's underwater topography and environmental conditions. These methods are necessary because traditional surface-based observation cannot capture the full complexity of the submerged caldera structure, particularly at depths where light penetration becomes minimal. Historical exploration efforts in steep crater environments have recorded instances where terrain complexity significantly limited full spatial assessment. Early scientific surveys of Crater Lake in the late 19th and early 20th centuries required careful navigation of unstable slopes and limited access points, with much of the interior terrain remaining difficult to document in detail. Even with modern tools, certain aspects of the caldera's structure continue to require indirect measurement rather than direct physical inspection due to the environmental constraints of the site. Thermal and structural stability in deep isolated lakes is influenced by vertical water column behavior rather than horizontal flow systems found in connected waterways. In Crater Lake, the absence of inflowing rivers means that internal conditions are primarily governed by precipitation, evaporation, and internal mixing processes that occur within the lake's own depth structure. This vertical system creates distinct layers that interact in ways that differ from lakes connected to external hydrological networks, where inflow and outflow continuously redistribute energy and materials. Human perception of environmental safety often relies on surface conditions that do not reflect subsurface spatial or thermal extremes. The calm appearance of Crater Lake can create an impression of uniform stability, yet the environmental conditions below the surface exist within a far more complex vertical system shaped by depth, pressure, and temperature gradients. This separation between surface perception and subsurface reality is a defining characteristic of deep caldera lakes, where what is visible does not fully represent the full physical structure beneath. Restricted ecological exchange in closed basin systems results in environmental characteristics that evolve independently from external hydrological influence. Because Crater Lake does not receive water from rivers or streams, its ecological processes develop primarily through internal cycling and atmospheric input, producing a system that is largely self-contained. This isolation contributes to its clarity and chemical stability, while also reinforcing its separation from surrounding environmental networks. Across geological timescales, caldera lakes maintain structural characteristics that preserve their original formation conditions in ways that remain visible in present-day measurements. The shape of Crater Lake's basin still reflects the collapse of Mount Mazama, with steep walls and a deep central depression that define its current form. Even after thousands of years of water accumulation, the underlying volcanic structure continues to determine the lake's fundamental geometry and behavior. Crater Lake's surface does not indicate that it rests above a volcanic basin nearly 2,000 feet deep, where the absence of outward flow leaves its structure entirely enclosed within the walls of its own formation. The storms of Lake Champlain. Positioned between the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada, Lake Champlain occupies a geographic corridor where regional weather systems frequently converge under shifting atmospheric pressure. This positioning places the lake within a transitional zone, where air masses moving through the surrounding Appalachian and Adirondack landscapes interact in ways that can influence sudden changes in local weather behavior. Rather than existing as an isolated climatic system, Lake Champlain functions as a meeting point for regional atmospheric movement, where conditions can shift as larger weather patterns pass through constrained terrain. Rapidly developing wind systems within enclosed inland basins can intensify over short distances when terrain channels airflow into narrow directional paths. In Lake Champlain, the surrounding landforms create natural corridors that can guide wind movement along the lake's length, increasing speed and altering surface behaviour in ways that may not be immediately predictable from shoreline observation alone. These localised accelerations do not require large-scale storm systems to develop, as even moderate atmospheric shifts can become more pronounced when shaped by geographic constraints. Historical records of navigation along Lake Champlain indicate that ferry and transport operations have long adjusted schedules in response to sudden environmental variability. Regular crossings between Vermont and New York, as well as routes extending toward the Canadian side of the lake, have historically required flexibility due to the lake's capacity for rapid changes in surface conditions. Operational adjustments in these contexts reflect not only seasonal weather patterns, but also the inherent variability of conditions within a geographically confined water system. Multiple naval engagements during the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 established Lake Champlain as a strategically significant inland water route. The lake served as a corridor for movement and confrontation between colonial and British forces, and remnants of this historical period remain part of its documented legacy. These military events contribute to the layered historical identity of the lake, where transportation, conflict, and geography intersect within the same confined body of water. Eyewitness descriptions from different historical periods vary significantly when recounting sudden changes in visibility and surface conditions across the lake. Some accounts describe abrupt shifts in wind intensity or wave formation, while others emphasize rapid changes in perceived distance or clarity between shoreline and open water. These variations in observation highlight how environmental conditions can be interpreted differently depending on position, timing, and local perspective at the moment of reporting. Localized storm formation over mid-sized freshwater systems can produce rapid transitions from calm conditions to high wave activity within limited time spans. On Lake Champlain, such transitions are often shaped by the interaction between incoming weather systems and the lake's elongated structure, which can allow wind energy to build along its length. This can result in conditions that appear stable at one moment and significantly altered shortly thereafter, depending on the direction and duration of atmospheric movement. Operational accounts from transport services on Lake Champlain document instances where weather conditions altered navigational decisions with little advance warning. Ferry operations and other scheduled crossings have historically required real-time assessment of lake conditions, as rapidly changing wind and surface behaviour can influence safety and timing. These operational records reflect a practical awareness of variability, where decision-making must adapt to shifting environmental inputs rather than rely solely on forecasted expectations. Perceptual inconsistencies in historical lake observations often emerge when comparing accounts recorded from shoreline positions versus open water perspectives. Observers stationed along the edge of the lake may experience different visual and auditory cues compared to those situated farther from land, particularly when weather conditions begin to shift. These differences can result in accounts that describe the same moment in contrasting ways, depending on observational position and environmental exposure. Environmental channeling effects created by surrounding terrain contribute to the acceleration of wind movement across elongated inland lake surfaces. In Lake Champlain, this effect is influenced by the orientation of the lake relative to regional topography, which can guide airflow in ways that amplify directional movement across the water. As a result, wind behaviour can become concentrated along specific axes, affecting surface conditions in ways that vary along different sections of the lake at the same time. Reports associated with regional folklore traditions surrounding Lake Champlain exist alongside documented maritime activity, without clear convergence between the two forms of record. Stories of unusual sightings and unexplained phenomena have circulated for generations, often existing independently from official navigational or historical documentation. While these accounts contribute to the cultural identity of the region, they remain distinct from verified operational records, creating parallel narratives that do not always intersect. Overlapping historical periods of civilian navigation and military activity on Lake Champlain reveal a persistent pattern of abrupt environmental variability, recorded in both formal reports and informal accounts. The coexistence of transportation records, military documentation, and local observations creates a layered historical record in which environmental behaviour is consistently noted as changeable and sometimes sudden. These records, while differing in purpose and detail, collectively reflect a shared recognition of the lake's shifting conditions. Different forms of recorded observation from the same lake often describe conditions that do not fully align, leaving multiple versions of the same environment existing side by side without a single unified interpretation. The Great Salt Lake's vanished voyages. Within endorheic lake systems lacking any external drainage outlet, long-term water behaviour is governed primarily by evaporation cycles and inflow imbalance rather than navigational continuity. The Great Salt Lake in Utah exists as one of the most prominent examples of this type of closed hydrological structure in North America, where water entering the basin has no river outlet, and instead leaves only through evaporation. Over extended periods, this process concentrates dissolved minerals and alters the physical properties of the water in ways that distinguish it sharply from connected freshwater systems used for transport or sustained navigation. Early industrial expectations regarding inland water transport often assumed that large surface areas could support sustained movement without accounting for chemical composition constraints. In the 19th century, as settlement and infrastructure expanded across the American West, the scale of the Great Salt Lake suggested to some observers a potential for transportation use similar to other large inland waters. However, this assumption did not fully consider how salinity levels and shifting shoreline conditions would affect the stability required for continuous vessel movement or predictable route establishment. Elevated salinity concentrations within terminal lakes significantly alter buoyancy dynamics, producing physical conditions that differ from standard freshwater navigation environments. In the Great Salt Lake, varying salt density across different sections of the basin can influence how objects float or behave in water, creating conditions that do not align with conventional maritime expectations. These physical differences contribute to an environment where movement is not inherently prevented, but where consistency of movement becomes difficult to maintain across broader areas of the lake. Attempts to establish consistent crossing routes across the Great Salt Lake encountered structural limitations that reduced the feasibility of continuous water-based transport systems. Historical efforts to move goods or establish reliable passage across the lake were repeatedly challenged by shifting water levels, variable depth zones, and inconsistent surface conditions. As a result, water-based transport remained limited in scope and eventually gave way to alternative methods that bypassed the lake entirely rather than attempting to integrate it into a continuous travel network. Shifts in shoreline position over extended time periods have been documented in relation to fluctuating water volume and evaporation rates within the basin. The Great Salt Lake does not maintain a fixed perimeter, and its shoreline can expand or contract depending on precipitation levels, river inflow, and evaporation intensity over time. This variability affects not only the visual scale of the lake, but also the practicality of any attempt to define stable entry or crossing points along its edge. Infrastructure developments surrounding the lake gradually redirected transportation activity toward fixed land-based systems rather than maintaining reliance on aquatic movement. Rail lines, road networks, and causeway constructions became more prominent in the region as water-based transport proved less reliable for sustained logistical use. These developments reflect a broader shift in how the lake was integrated into regional movement systems, moving away from direct navigation and towards structural avoidance. Operational records from early transport planning in the region reflect repeated adjustments made in response to inconsistent surface conditions and environmental variability. Planning documents and logistical assessments from different periods show that route feasibility across the lake was frequently reassessed as environmental conditions changed. These adjustments highlight the difficulty of treating the Great Salt Lake as a stable corridor for repeated or predictable passage. Comparative analysis of freshwater navigation systems highlights significant functional differences when applied to hypersaline environments with limited ecological exchange. Unlike river-connected or freshwater lake systems, the Great Salt Lake operates under conditions where external inflow does not translate into outward flow, and where chemical concentration plays a central role in shaping surface and subsurface behaviour. This distinction makes direct comparison with traditional navigation environments structurally incomplete, as the underlying systems operate on different physical principles. Engineering assessments of lake crossing feasibility consistently identify chemical and structural factors as primary constraints on sustained maritime-style operations. Evaluations of potential transport use across the lake have repeatedly emphasized limitations imposed by salinity variation, shallow depth regions, and long-term environmental fluctuation. These constraints reduce the reliability of continuous water-based transit and require alternative infrastructure approaches when sustained movement is required. Public perception of large inland lakes can diverge from their actual usability as transport corridors when environmental chemistry is not factored into operational assumptions. The Great Salt Lake's expansive surface can create an impression of navigability similar to other large bodies of water, yet its internal conditions differ in ways that directly affect movement feasibility. This gap between visual scale and functional capability contributes to misunderstandings about how such systems can be utilized. Documented phases of attempted utilization consistently show that the Great Salt Lake produces conditions incompatible with stable, continuous voyage systems regardless of the operational approach applied. Repeated efforts across different periods and methods reveal a consistent pattern in which water-based movement cannot be maintained as a continuous system, due to the combined effects of chemical composition, shoreline variability, and structural inconsistency across the basin. On the Great Salt Lake, movement exists only in fragmented and conditional forms that never stabilize into the kind of continuous voyage system required for sustained passage across its surface, the deadly fog of Lake Tahoe. Elevational positioning above surrounding valleys places Lake Tahoe within an atmospheric zone where air density and temperature gradients behave differently from nearby lowland environments. Situated along the crest of the Sierra Nevada, the lake exists within a high-altitude basin, where diurnal temperature shifts can be more pronounced than in lower surrounding regions, influencing how air and moisture interact above the water surface. This positioning creates conditions where atmospheric behavior does not always follow the same predictable patterns associated with warmer, lower elevation freshwater systems. Water transparency measurements recorded in Lake Tahoe indicate conditions where submerged visibility can extend to depths uncommon among large freshwater lakes in North America. Historically, the lake has been recognized for its exceptional clarity, a result of low sediment input and limited nutrient concentration compared to many other inland bodies of water. Under stable conditions, light penetration can reach significant depths, allowing the lake's interior structure to remain visible in ways that contribute to its reputation for clarity rather than concealment. Nighttime cooling over mountainous lake basins initiates moisture condensation processes that can rapidly concentrate near the water surface under specific thermal conditions. As heat radiates away from the surface after sunset, cooler air layers form close to the water, and when these layers intersect with available atmospheric moisture, condensation can develop in localized regions. In enclosed or partially enclosed basins like those surrounding Lake Tahoe, these processes can intensify under calm conditions where air movement is limited. Visual navigation across open alpine water can lose all fixed reference points when atmospheric moisture density increases beyond perceptible threshold limits. On Lake Tahoe, where long stretches of open water separate distant shorelines, even moderate reductions in visibility can significantly affect the ability to maintain orientation. When atmospheric conditions reduce contrast between water, sky, and land, the spatial structure that normally guides movement becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish. Open water movement in recreational lake environments often depends on continuous visual tracking of shoreline geometry in the absence of constructed navigational markers. Lake Tahoe, like many large natural lakes, relies heavily on environmental reference points rather than artificial guidance systems for small-scale navigation. When those visual cues are reduced or temporarily obscured, the ability to maintain directional consistency becomes dependent on prior orientation rather than active visual confirmation. Vertical air displacement restriction caused by temperature inversion layers can trap low-lying moisture above lake surfaces in enclosed mountain basins. In such conditions, warmer air positioned above cooler surface air creates a stabilizing layer that limits vertical mixing, effectively holding moisture close to the water surface. This atmospheric structure can contribute to sudden and localized reductions in visibility without requiring large-scale weather systems to be present. Submerged environmental conditions in deep freshwater lakes contribute to preservation states that reduce long-term degradation of objects resting at depth. Lake Tahoe's cold, deep waters create an environment where decomposition processes occur at slower rates compared to warmer, more biologically active systems. As a result, objects that enter deeper zones of the lake can remain structurally intact for extended periods, preserved by consistently low temperatures and reduced biological activity. Recorded observational differences from Lake Tahoe describe abrupt transitions between high-clarity conditions and near-total visual obstruction within short temporal windows. Accounts from visitors and observers across different periods often note how quickly atmospheric conditions can change, particularly when fog formation develops in localized regions. These shifts can occur in ways that significantly alter perception of distance and spatial layout within moments, rather than gradually over extended periods. Loss of spatial orientation over water becomes significantly more pronounced when both horizon definition and shoreline contrast disappear simultaneously. In Lake Tahoe, when fog or condensation reduces visibility, the absence of clear dividing lines between water, sky, and land can create conditions where directional awareness is weakened. Without stable reference points, even short distances across open water can become difficult to accurately judge. Perceptual discontinuity between expected visual range and actual atmospheric density can produce disorientation even in physically stable surface conditions. This effect is particularly noticeable in environments where high clarity is the norm, as the sudden introduction of visual obstruction creates a contrast that is not easily anticipated by perception alone. The result is not a change in the physical structure of the lake, but a shift in how that structure is interpreted through limited sensory input. Documented observational records of Lake Tahoe consistently show that optical clarity and atmospheric obstruction can alternate without corresponding changes in physical lake behavior. The water itself remains unchanged in structure and composition during these transitions, yet the surrounding atmospheric conditions can redefine how the environment is perceived from moment to moment. This separation between physical stability and visual variability is a recurring feature in accounts describing the lake's behavior. Lake Tahoe's surface can appear unchanged while the surrounding space shifts into complete visual ambiguity, leaving only the same physical water beneath a perception that no longer matches what can be seen. Lake Mead, the vanishing waters that reveal forgotten depths. For decades, the vast reservoir of Lake Mead was understood as a controlled and engineered body of water, held in place by one of the most significant infrastructure projects in the United States, yet beneath its surface lay a landscape that was never fully visible to those who passed above it. Its waters, formed by the construction of the Hoover Dam, created an artificial lake that gradually concealed entire stretches of canyon floor, roadbeds, and remnants of human activity that existed long before inundation. For much of its modern history, Lake Mead appeared stable on the surface, its level carefully managed through long-standing water distribution systems that supported entire regions of the American Southwest. Over time, however, changes in regional water availability began to alter the appearance of this engineered environment, and Lake Mead slowly started to recede in ways that exposed portions of its submerged history. What had once been permanently hidden beneath deep reservoir waters began to re-emerge, revealing sections of terrain that had not been seen for decades. This shift did not occur abruptly, but through a gradual reduction in water levels that transformed the lake from a covering surface into a revealing one, exposing what had been sealed away since its creation. As water levels continued to decline, previously submerged objects began to reappear in areas that had long been mapped as deep reservoir zones. Boats that had sunk and remained out of sight for years were found resting on exposed lakebed terrain, sometimes preserved in surprising structural condition due to limited oxygen exposure beneath the water. In certain locations, remnants of human activity, such as vehicles and debris fields, became visible again, not through excavation, but through the simple retreat of water that had once concealed them entirely. These emerging discoveries created a shift in how Lake Mead was perceived, transforming it from a static reservoir into a changing archive of submerged history. Areas that were once considered permanently inaccessible began to function as open records of past activity, where physical evidence resurfaced without deliberate retrieval efforts. The lakebed, shaped by both natural geology and pre-inundation human use, began to act as a layered surface, where different time periods overlapped visually as water levels changed. The exposure of submerged objects also introduced challenges in interpretation, as items that resurfaced did not always carry clear contextual information about how they ended up in their final positions. Without complete environmental records for every submerged area before flooding, reconstructing the circumstances behind certain findings required careful analysis of fragmentary evidence. This created a situation where visibility increased, but certainty did not always follow, since the original conditions that placed objects underwater were not always fully documented. In several areas of the exposed lakebed, previously inaccessible terrain revealed structural remnants that suggested long-term human presence before the reservoir's creation. These features, now visible due to receding water, offered a rare glimpse into landscapes that had been submerged for generations. However, the transition from a submerged environment to exposed ground also introduced erosion and surface alteration, complicating efforts to interpret what was being seen in its original form. As Lake Mead's water levels continued to fluctuate, the boundary between hidden and visible terrain shifted repeatedly, altering how historical evidence could be observed at different times. Objects that appeared during low water periods were not always accessible later, as rising levels or shifting shoreline conditions could resubmerge previously exposed features. This dynamic created a continuously changing environment in which visibility depended on timing rather than permanence. The unusual nature of these resurfacing discoveries also influenced how Lake Mead was studied, as researchers and observers began to treat it not only as a reservoir, but also as an evolving historical site. Each decline in water level introduced new layers of material for examination, while also removing others from view, creating a cycle of intermittent exposure. This made it difficult to form a complete and uninterrupted record of what lay beneath the surface at any given moment. In some cases, objects recovered or observed during low water periods could not be fully contextualized due to missing supporting records or incomplete historical documentation. Without consistent pre-inundation mapping of every submerged area, certain findings remained partially unclassified, existing as physical evidence without complete narrative placement. This added another layer of uncertainty to the lake's already complex transformation over time. The changing conditions of Lake Mead also highlighted how human engineering and environmental variation can interact in ways that produce unexpected forms of visibility. A system designed to store and regulate water eventually became a system that intermittently reveals what was assumed to be permanently hidden. This reversal of expectation, where coverage becomes exposure, distinguishes Lake Mead from many of the other environments discussed in this series. As the lake continues to fluctuate, the exposed remains on its lakebed serve as temporary records of submerged history, visible only under specific environmental conditions that do not remain constant. What appears at one stage may disappear again at another, depending entirely on the shifting balance of inflow and demand across the broader water system that sustains the reservoir. Lake Mead's submerged landscape does not remain hidden in the traditional sense, but instead moves between concealment and exposure, revealing fragments of its past in cycles shaped by changing water levels. The lakes that keep their secrets, inland waters separated by thousands of miles, still generate accounts of sudden navigational uncertainty that appear strikingly similar in structure, despite no shared geographic connection. This observation does not point to a single lake or a single event, but rather to a repeated way in which human experience on large bodies of inland water is translated into language. The Great Lakes, high-altitude alpine lakes, and enclosed saline basins all differ dramatically in physical composition, yet the written and oral records associated with them often begin to resemble one another when describing moments of instability or confusion on open water. Survivors describing unexpected shifts in orientation on open water often rely on nearly identical sequences of explanation, even when the incidents occurred in entirely different regions. The initial sense of stability, followed by an abrupt loss of reference points, appears repeatedly in testimonies collected from unrelated locations. While each account is tied to a specific environment, the structure of how the experience is communicated tends to follow a familiar progression, as if the mind itself organizes uncertainty into a predictable narrative pattern when faced with disorienting conditions. Cautionary phrases passed through lake navigation communities tend to preserve their meaning over generations, even as wording and regional context change. In many inland regions, especially those with long histories of boating, fishing, or ferry transport, warnings about changing water conditions or sudden visibility loss are repeated in simplified forms. These phrases often lose their original situational detail over time, yet retain their core message, suggesting that the transmission of caution operates independently from the specific environment in which it originated. Official incident logs involving inland waterways frequently maintain consistent descriptive structures, even when the environmental conditions being recorded differ substantially. Whether documenting mechanical failure, weather-related disruption, or navigational error, many records follow a standardized format that prioritizes sequence and outcome over subjective interpretation. This consistency allows incidents from different lakes and time periods to appear structurally similar, even when the underlying causes are unrelated or unique to each situation. Before formal record-keeping systems existed, oral traditions surrounding lake travel already emphasized simplified warnings that prioritize survival over technical accuracy. Early accounts of inland navigation were often passed directly between individuals and communities, shaped by memory, repetition, and the need for immediate practical understanding. In these narratives, environmental complexity was frequently reduced into essential instructions or cautionary statements, creating a foundation for later storytelling patterns that would persist even after formal documentation began. Written accounts of lake-related disruption often converge on similar narrative sequences during moments where environmental uncertainty becomes difficult to interpret in real time. When visibility decreases, orientation becomes unstable, or environmental cues lose clarity, descriptions tend to emphasize a sudden transition from control to confusion. This transition is consistently reflected in the structure of many reports, regardless of whether the underlying cause was atmospheric, mechanical, or situational in origin. Cultural interpretations of lake environments evolve independently from formal documentation, yet still reflect recurring thematic patterns related to unpredictability and risk. Folklore, regional storytelling, and informal accounts often emphasize cautionary elements that mirror, in simplified form, the structure found in official records. These interpretations do not always aim to describe factual events precisely, but they often preserve the emotional or psychological experience associated with uncertainty on inland waters. Physical differences between lake systems do not prevent human observers from producing remarkably similar descriptions when sudden changes disrupt environmental expectations. A calm surface that becomes visually confusing, or a stable environment that shifts without clear warning, tends to produce comparable descriptive reactions across different settings. The consistency lies not in the environment itself, but in the way perception responds when expected. Conditions no longer match observed reality. Historical record-keeping methods used for lake incidents preserve recognizable storytelling structures, even as administrative styles and reporting standards change over time. Early handwritten logs, later standardized maritime reports, and modern safety documentation may differ in format, yet they often retain a similar internal logic when describing sequence, disruption, and resolution. This continuity suggests that the framework for recording such events has remained relatively stable, even as technology and terminology have evolved. Shared cognitive tendencies in interpreting environmental instability appear repeatedly in lake-related accounts, regardless of the specific physical setting in which they occur. When individuals encounter sudden uncertainty in natural environments, especially over water, the mind tends to organize sensory input into familiar patterns to reduce ambiguity. This process can produce similarities in description that emerge independently of communication or shared experience. Comparison of multiple lake systems reveals that consistency appears not in environmental behavior, but in the repeated transformation of different experiences into nearly identical narrative forms. Lakes such as those in the Great Lakes region, alpine basins, and enclosed saltwater systems all operate under distinct physical conditions, yet accounts of human interaction with them often converge in how events are described. This convergence highlights the role of human interpretation as an active shaping force in how environmental events are recorded and remembered. The most persistent pattern found in inland lake accounts is not the nature of the water itself, but the way different observers continually reshape unrelated events into the same recognizable structure of explanation.